Frigga, and for most goddesses, we generally offer wines. It's sort of the ladylike thing to do, but some ladies in Norse mythologies aren't quite ladies. We offer them something else. Welcome to Northwoods Kindred. I'm your Gothi Bodvarr, and on this channel we discuss all things Asatru Kindred related. So hit that subscribe button if you want to see how we do it in the Northwoods. What we have here is a part 2 to last week's video because it ran long and we thought that the information was easier to absorb if we busted it into 2 parts. So I'm not going to sit around here and blab too much about it, but I do want to remind you that there's a download. If you want to get it, there's a download on the website. Link is below. It's the same download as last week's. It's all the information combined into one packet that you can print off and then put into your Gothi binder. So without further ado, we'll get right back into the video where we left it off. Odin's role in 2023 is different than Odin's role in 793. Now, once you got a good grasp on the history of it and you understand in context how the specific deity that you're wanting to work with puts things together, it always helps if you're going to do one of these handouts or one of these pages for your book is to go through and track down any of the sagas or eddas or stories or even some occasional articles if you find them to be a good reference. And list those or a reference to those in your notes so that when you study up on that deity, if you want more information, you know exactly which books to open and which pages to go to in order to get that information. And so again, on my handout here, I've listed 22 that prominently feature Odin or Odin's activities, like Voluspa, the Havamal, Vafnrudismal, Grimnismal, the Lokasena. These are all important, but I have 22 different sagas that Odin plays a prominent role in that are listed here. Save you from doing that little bit of homework if you want to download this and add it to your book. But if you don't, like I said, the best way to do that is to get yourself a digital copy, like on a Kindle, of the Poetic Edda, the Elder Edda, the Viking Age by Duchalu, and any other documents that you find to be necessary in your practice, and then just search by those terms. Just type in Odin and figure out where everything pops up. So some of the main sources that we have for all of our gods and goddesses is, of course, the Poetic Edda or Saemnder's Edda or the Elder Edda. So it's got those 3 names: Poetic Edda, Saemnder's Edda, and Elder Edda. And there's dozens of translations of it. I tend to like the older translations, but you buy whatever speaks to you or whatever reads well. Some translations are leaning towards the poetry and the meter of the, more the poetic voice. Some are leaning more towards the literal meaning of the stanza, and some try to bridge so it's still kind of poetic, but still kind of gets the meaning right also. And those are the ones that I prefer. Hollander's Edda would be one of my favorites because he does just that. And you can go to the extreme one or the other, one side or the other. And even some Poetic Eddas aren't the least bit poetic anymore and have been deduced to a story form where you can just read the story. We have the Prose Edda, which is Snorri's Edda or the Younger Edda. So Prose Edda, Snorri's Edda, Younger Edda. That's a whole nother Edda, and there's a few different translations of that as well. Some of the information with the Elder Edda is conflicting. Some of it is complementary. Read it and judge for yourself which ones you would like. And then we have the sagas. The sagas, more specifically speaking of the Icelandic sagas, I won't go into too much detail about them, but there's a ton of them, and there's just massive amounts of information on the day-to-day life of people during that period of in history that the sagas cover. And there's also other little documents like Saxo Grammaticus's History of the Danes, the Journal of Ibn Fahlan, and a few others. I did a whole thing on resources, but those are going to be the primary ones that we go to when we're trying to research and get information for putting together ritual for our kin. Now, in addition to the primary sources, those older pieces, we also have secondary sources, and some of those are going to be scholarly works based on interpretations from the primary sources, which are going to cover. That's going to be things like Duchalu's The Viking Age, Teutonic Mythology by Jacob Grimm, Teutonic Mythology by Victor Rydberg, books like that where a scholar sat down, compiled data, and then put the pieces together. A couple of other good modern versions of that are The Viking Way by Neil Price, which is a really good piece. It gathers a lot of the older information with some newer stuff and puts that together and makes a lot of sense out of it. And then you have the Encyclopedia of Norse and Germanic Folklore, Mythology, and Magic by Claude Lecote. Very, very good book. And it is a encyclopedia. You just bounce through it, alphabetical order like you would expect from a encyclopedia or dictionary type. And that's a really good reference to look at, too, to get the nuts and bolts information on any one of the deities or place names or anything like that. When you put all those pieces together, that's how you get a really good picture of the age, the god or the deity, the worship, and the methods in which they were honored, and the right ways to do that, while also being able to bring them into our modern life where it makes sense to a modern, 2023 human being. One way to really color all that in and get a lot more value out of it is to study multiple versions. It's not a great idea to find one version of one of these documents and decide that that's your favorite and then create a dogma surrounding it, because you might find that the next version of it that you pick up contradicts a good portion of it, and the next version contradicts both of them. Read as many different versions of these as you can get and make up your own mind about what they mean. Don't let someone else tell you what they mean. Kind of tapping back to the previous part, pay attention to the cultural and historic context that these stories take place in, such as reading Saxo Grammaticus. Know that he's a Dane, and he's going to elevate the Danes in that light. So think about the context when you're reading these works, and just keep that in mind as you work your way through these various different documents. Used other secondary sources such as academic articles. Universities publish articles all the time. There's a multitude of respectable websites that publish articles and ideas about different aspects of Norse culture, Norse life, the gods, and the practice. Feel free to consult them, because sometimes you may not agree 100% with the author, but one or two pieces that they've mentioned could be exactly what you needed to fill a hole that you were already working on. They might have just figured out that one little piece, or maybe they didn't and it just happens to work for you. But don't neglect them as a possible source of very useful information if you take it in context to where you're getting it and the era in which it came from. The only real caveat is when you're looking at the secondary sources. For one, try not to lean in too much into your own confirmation bias and leaning into people who think the way you do, such as some people really gravitate towards the way of fire and ice, whereas I think that book is way more political than it needs to be in order to give information on the Norse paths. Another example would be that whether or not, in your estimation, the person who wrote the book is qualified to tell you about your path and the gods. A good example would be Dr. Jackson Crawford's Poetic Edda. Crawford is intimately qualified to write a book about the Poetic Edda and his own translations. In contrast to that, we have Neil Gaiman, who wrote Norse mythology, which everybody seems to love. But I don't necessarily want to look at Gaiman's book like it's going to give me any information I don't already have, because anything in there that seems new is probably fictitious, and a way to double check is to vet the author. Like, go on Amazon and search Neil Gaiman books, just books by Neil Gaiman. And when you see the collection of books that he wrote, you're probably not going to put a whole lot of heavy academic weight on Norse mythology by Neil Gaiman. It may be a good read, probably good for children, but it's probably not your primary source for learning about the deities in a way that you're going to want to venerate them in ritual. Another part of doing the research that you should take a real close look at is try to vet the author. Like, learn about the author, Google them, look at their Wikipedia pages, and figure out who the person is that wrote the book, because that could tell you a lot about the opinions that they try to manipulate you into when you read their work. So look at the publishers and decide if that's a publishing house where you want to put money into. Figure out where their money goes, if you can. Someone like Penguin or some benign or some really large publishing house is probably a safe bet. But some of the smaller, less-known publishing houses, they may have politics that conflict your politics, and you may not want to give them your patronage. If that's the case, then know what you're doing when you get into it. But you would probably want to research the publishers. And some published houses in general are known for garbage, and some are known for real factual information or scholarly type works. So the publishing house alone can tell you a lot about the quality of the book, regardless of how many stars it gets on Amazon. And lastly, read the content and evaluate it for yourself. If you start reading through the book and there's a lot of points in books, especially the New Age style books or the new writings, like, how to start in Asatru or how to do this or that. When you read those, if you start getting a bad feeling about it, there's a good chance that that author is writing from a place that you'll never be. They're in a different state of being. They have different ideologies, different ideas about the faith and the practice, and that's probably not going to be a good book for you. It's one of the things that I miss about the physical brick and mortar bookstores is going in, cracking the book open to a random page, and reading a few pages and seeing if I agree with the author in general. Now, I'm not one that seeks out confirmation bias in everything, but there are other situations where the author's personal politics come into play, and I don't want anything to do with them, and I don't even want to hear what they have to say. So if that's you, if you have those types of bias, know what you're getting into. Do your homework. And always remember to look at the date of publication, because the most current data is generally considered to be the more correct, but especially if you're looking at a publication, an older publication, say from the 1880s or 1890s, and it has archaeological data, something that's a little bit more modern, that archaeological data is probably going to reflect what it was used for in that time a little bit better, because the professionals have had more time to study the equipment. They've had other bits and pieces that have been found over the last 100 or so years, and it paints a more fuller picture. So those ideas and those hypotheses from the 1800s are going to evolve. So in a lot of cases, those newer books are going to tell you more accurately what some of the archaeological finds in some of the digs and things are about, better than the older books will. But the older books are going to contain less politically motivated information and be a little bit more true, I think, to the scholarly middle of the road work, as opposed to an extreme left or right sort of ideology. Now, an application, once you've researched this deity, now you may be doing this for a kindred to do a large bloat, or even a large public bloat with 20 or more people, or you could be doing this just to set up your own personal altar. But all of this work is going to come to play. It's easy to throw a bookshelf in the corner and toss on pine needles and a rock and some bark and put this and say this is to Odin because we're connected to nature. It's easy to do that. It's a lot harder to actually do the work and then find things that really connect to the god or the deity that you're trying to research, and then put those things on the altar, things that bridge the connection between you and them, between your world and their world, such as a raven feather would be a much better connection with Odin than a pine cone. Now, if you didn't know that Odin had two ravens and was heavily connected to those birds, you may not know to do that. You can only get that by reading the stories and doing the research. So if you're doing the research just to look at one of your own personal deities, your patron or your matron, to build an altar, I would say build the altar for sure, and then add pieces to it as you go. There's always going to be some basics there on every altar. If it's used for ritual purposes, you find a raven feather when you're out on a walk in the woods. Take that feather and add it to your altar. Do these things that connect you to the deity for which you're trying to connect, if you tend to have a setup for a specific deity. I don't happen to have one for that purpose, but I have bits and things that I will, if I want to meditate and communicate with Odin without doing a formal ritual, then I have items that I will put on my altar to signify his presence. And when that's done, then I'll put them back in their resting place. And then the altar is pretty much sterile and open to all gods, goddesses, wights, and supernatural creatures. So if you have a setup like that, I encourage you to meditate and then invoke that deity, invoke your matron or your patron or whatever god or goddess you're trying to get information from. Invoke them during that meditation. Talk to them in your head. Now, I believe that words have power, especially when said aloud, but there's also space for us to just talk and have a conversation with the gods, sort of on an equal footing in our own meditative space. So don't neglect that as an opportunity to discuss your rituals and to work them out with the gods themselves. You'd be surprised if you sit down in meditation and talk to Odin and say, I want to do this and this and this, and what do you think about this? You'll be surprised the voices that talk back to you and say, maybe if you did it this way, or that's probably not a good idea in this crowd. You'd be surprised how many voices come back into your head, and you can look at it as divine intervention, or you can look at it as your brain just working out the pieces. However you want to look at it, there's magic in that. So don't neglect the opportunity to do it. And of course, the goal of all of this is to be able to know the deities, know them like a kinsman, and then incorporate them into your rituals by using their tools, their stories, and their bits and pieces. And as you get used to doing that and you start incorporating them into your rituals and then incorporating them into an entire gathering or a gathering weekend or a large event, you can also start taking those same techniques and incorporating these deities into your daily life. And when you start incorporating them into your daily life, you'll find you're never alone. There's always somebody there to talk to, and there's always help when you need it. If you just look up and say, hey, kind of in a pickle. Once you've absorbed and taken in all of this information about your patron deity, explore how you can incorporate them into your daily life, and you can do daily dedications or daily practices that honor them as you go about your daily routine. Incorporate them into your full daily life, and it'll be a lot easier when it comes time to venerate them in ritual and formal gathering to incorporate them into that, because you will already have a practice. You will have already opened that line of communication, and you will already have that relationship with the god. And one thing I want to emphasize, when you do your research and you invoke these deities, I don't particularly care for the word invoke. I like invite, but invoke is, I guess, the proper term. Sounds demanding to me, but you can call it whatever you like. But when you invoke the deities into your life, make your intentions clear. It's okay to have demands, and it's okay to say, we invite you here for this purpose. Then they know why they're coming. It's always, if you've ever been in a job or in a role where you were giving very clear instructions to execute, it's always more relieving than if somebody just gives you general instructions and expects you to fill in the blanks. It's a lot easier if you know the intent. Knowing how much value is in intent, when we invite the gods into our lives, we always want to invite them in with intent. Odin, we call on you here so we may give you thanks for your help in this trial that we went through. We saw your inspiration in these things and in this story, and we see the example that you set for us in this situation and that situation. You know, when you invoke them, when you invite them in, if you flatter a little, but you tell them why you're asking them to come here. We need your help in this ritual. We need your help in this healing, in this rune work. But we ask you here to guide us spiritually on this quest, whatever it happens to be. Always ask with intent. Now, once you know the deity that you're invoking, in this case Odin, we want to incorporate him into ritual. And one way that we incorporate Odin into our rituals is we try to feed the crows, so it's really nice if we can get the crows and ravens over here squawking and making noise. That's always a bonus when that happens, but it's not always something we can rely on. I do use a gungnir. I use my short spear for ritual in place of the hammer, or sometimes in conjunction with my hammer. Effigies of ravens and wolves around. Often when I do an Odin bloat, I will wear a wolf hide over my shoulders. It's not cosplay, it's part of the connection. When invoking or inviting Odin, poetry is very important to him, as he is the patron of skalds as well as kings and warriors. If you can recite poetry, especially original poetry written about the deeds of Odin, those are the types of thing that gains his favor. And so if you're not super confident with poetry readings or anything like that, you can always read passages from the Havamal, especially if you happen to be going through some time where there are certain passages in the Havamal that are applicable to the reason that you're invoking Odin in the first place. That's sort of like doubling down on that magnetic energy, I think. And of course, the ultimate goal here is to make offerings and sacrifices to these deities. So one of the things that we glean by reading their stories and extracting all this information is we learn what they like and what they don't like. Thor likes beer. Thor likes meat. Odin never touches meat, doesn't eat food, has no use for it, only wine and mead. So if we're going to bloat to Odin, we will offer him wine or mead, usually mead. Thor, we generally offer beer, and sometimes even meat. Frigga, and for most goddesses, we generally offer wines. It's sort of the ladylike thing to do, but some ladies in Norse mythologies aren't quite ladies. We offer them something else. So to wrap this whole thing up into a nice little tight bundle, I want to just kind of briefly go over the key takeaways for when you're researching a god or a deity for ritual. How important was that god in the history and the culture of the people? what are some of the key elements that that particular deity or entity is associated with? Is it associated with crafts? Is it associated with magic? Is it associated with ritual? Is it associated with poetry? Get down to the personality of that deity. Learn about the artifacts and the tools and the accoutrements that are associated also with that deity, such as with Freya. We have her falcon dress that was so prominently displayed when Loki borrowed it to help retrieve Mjolnir. We have the Brisingamen necklace. We have her boars. We have her as the Queen of the Valkyries. There's lots of different things that we associate only with Freya. All of the gods have those fine things that are associated with only them. Know what those are. Know the historical context. So aside from their own sagas and eddas, but what was the history of the people that wrote down the stories back then, and what was the politics that was being injected into those translations. Record yourself a list of some of the primary and secondary sources that you can go to if you need to refresh your brain on some of this information. And then go into practical application in ritual and study and put all of those pieces into action by calling on the gods, venerating them, making offerings to them, and building a relationship with the gods as if they were a kinsman. Now, I really encourage you to get excited about this and grab your notebook and write down a list of all the gods you can think of, or at least the ones that you would want to work with in the near future, and then start diving into this practice and just go down that list, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and fill in all those blanks on each of those gods. And you can always add more pages later, and you can always go to my website and download this little pamphlet here and add it to your book as well. I suggest that you keep notes, do your own research, and then get these also, and you'll have the full picture when it's time for you to do your own rituals. And so to wrap it all up, I want to say it's really important when you do this research to approach it with an open heart and an open mind. Do not inject your own political bias into it, and don't believe other people's political bias that's been injected into information that's out there. Try to approach the information from a point of just information without any bias or any politics or any social norms or any judgment placed on it. Just read the information, take it in, and then decide what you can use and what you can't. You don't have to change it, but you don't have to use it all either. You can just take bits and pieces that work in your practice for your rituals, and you can include it, and you can discard the things that don't necessarily work for you. There are no rules here. Researching the gods and the deities and other entities for ritual practice is arguably one of the most important roles that a Gothi is going to have. In addition to the actual physical ritual that you have to perform, one of the most important things is to be able to educate your kinsmen on these deities, to show an aptitude for the lore and for study and for putting the information together and to deliver it to your people as a mentor. Because at the end of the day, if you're the Gothi of your kindred, your Sippo, or your stead, your kindred is going to come to you and they're going to ask questions about this and that, and they're going to read a little piece of information and come to you with questions about it. I want to kind of overemphasize that the ability to do the research on the gods and to grab all those little bits and pieces of information and put them in a document and put them into something that you can use is probably one of the hardest parts about being the Gothi. It's not so hard to perform a ritual. It's not so hard to perform a wedding or an Alsavatni. It's hard to get the information together and then create something that's going to be moving, that's going to touch people. It's going to make them feel like it's something they've never felt before, and it's still going to have the air and the essence of our historic examples that we can draw out of the lore. You can't get there unless you do the study and you do the practice and you do the work. But it all comes down to being able to do a little bit of research, put that into something we can use, and then go put it into practice in your own ritual space for your own kinsmen. If you can do that, then you've earned your title of Gothi. So Havamal stanza 55, middling wise every man should be, beware of being too wise. For a wise man's heart is seldom happy if too great the wisdom he won. In other words, it's best not to know more than is good or useful. You are not expected to know how to be a Gothi when you get the job. You're expected to learn as you Gothi. Thor Vigi, my friends. Some ladies in Norse mythologies aren't quite ladies. We offer them something else.
Whoa! There's my stinger. Like, bam, stinger.
That's a good one, huh?
That was a good one.
You know what I'm talking about.
You know what you're talking about.